We begin our journey not with a bang, but with a whisper, the soft, shuffling retreat of an empire. Picture it, if you can, a landscape of rolling hills and dense woodlands, speckled with the ghosts of Roman villas and the decaying remnants of straight stone roads. For nearly 400 years, Britannia had been a far-flung province of the Roman Empire, a place of legions and law, of baths and mosaics, and a sense of order that stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. But in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, that order began to fray. The vast, overstretched empire was under pressure from all sides, and the emperors in Rome made the difficult decision to recall their legions from the distant island. The last of the Roman soldiers are thought to have departed sometime around 410 AD, leaving the Romano-British inhabitants to fend for themselves. This was a moment of profound and lasting change, a pivot point in the very identity of the island. Imagine the silence that must have fallen as the tramp of marching boots faded into the sea mist. The Romanized Britons, accustomed to a life protected by imperial might, were now alone. The immediate aftermath of this withdrawal is a shadowy period in history, often called the Dark Ages, for a reason. There are few written records, and what we know comes mostly from archaeological finds and later often biased accounts. We can only imagine the fear and uncertainty that must have swept through the land. Without the Roman military presence to enforce order, the carefully constructed society began to crumble. The local leaders, many of whom had adopted Roman names and customs, found themselves facing a power vacuum. The old ways, the tribal rivalries that had been suppressed for centuries, began to reemerge. And from across the North Sea, new threats were gathering. These were not the organized, disciplined armies of Rome, but something else entirely. A slow, relentless trickle of new peoples. They came in small, open boats, landing on the eastern shores with a sense of purpose and a desire for new land. These were the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The arrival of these new peoples wasn't a single dramatic invasion like something out of a blockbuster movie. Instead, it was a gradual process of migration and settlement that spanned many decades. The Romano-British population, lacking a unified military command, struggled to repel them. Some historians suggest that some of these Germanic warriors may have even been initially invited as mercenaries, hired to protect the Britons from other raiders, such as the Picts and Scots from the north. A classic case of inviting the fox into the henhouse, perhaps. Either way, the new arrivals quickly saw the opportunity that presented itself. They began to establish their own settlements, not just as hired help, but as new lords of the land. This period is a fascinating puzzle for scholars. One of the central questions historians still debate is the extent to which the native Romano-British population was replaced or simply assimilated by the Anglo-Saxons. Did the Britons flee to the western fringes of the island, to places like Wales and Cornwall, or did they live side by side with the newcomers, eventually adopting their language and customs? The evidence is a mix of archaeology, which shows a gradual shift in pottery and burial styles, and linguistics, which shows a near-total replacement of the British Celtic language with Old English. It's likely that it wasn't a single story, but a mosaic of different experiences across the island, with some areas seeing more conflict and others a more peaceful integration. Over time, these Germanic settlements grew into a patchwork of small kingdoms. The name England itself comes from the Angles, and the name Saxon from the Saxons. The Jutes, meanwhile, settled primarily in the southeast, in what would become Kent. The boundaries of these kingdoms were fluid, constantly shifting as ambitious warlords vied for supremacy. This period, from the 5th to the 8th centuries, is often referred to as the Heptarchy, a term meaning rule of 7, because there were 7 dominant kingdoms that rose and fell in influence: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Imagine a geopolitical map of the island, where the borders were constantly being redrawn with a dirty finger. It was a time of frequent warfare, of shifting alliances, and of the slow, painful birth of a new identity for the land. The old Roman ways, once so dominant, began to fade into memory, replaced by a new culture and a new language that would one day become the English we speak today. The stage was being set, the board was being arranged, and a new story was about to begin. As the Roman legacy slowly faded into the damp soil of Britain, the new kingdoms of the Angles and Saxons began to solidify their power. The period known as the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy was a complex and often violent time, a kaleidoscope of small realms fighting for dominance. Imagine a board game where the pieces are constantly moving, with no one ever truly winning for long. The names of these kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and the rest, would become the building blocks of England itself. For a time, Northumbria in the north and then Mercia in the Midlands were the most powerful, their kings claiming a kind of loose overlordship over the others. But this was a fragile supremacy, easily shattered by a new ambitious ruler or a devastating battle. Life for most people during this era was centered on the small village or farmstead. People lived in small, timber-framed houses, clustered together for protection, and their days were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, planting, harvesting, and trying to survive the long, cold winters. Society was structured around the king, who was seen as a warrior leader, his power resting on his ability to protect his people and win battles. Beneath him were the nobles, or ealdormen, who were granted land in exchange for military service, and then the freemen, who owned their own land, and at the bottom, the enslaved. This was a world of close-knit communities, pagan beliefs slowly giving way to new ideas from the continent, and the constant threat of rival kingdoms. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons was a slow, deliberate process, not a sudden event. It began in the late 6th century with the mission of St. Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great. He landed in Kent, where the king, Ethelbert, was married to a Christian Frankish princess. This was a clever strategic move, as her influence helped to smooth the way for the new religion. From there, Christianity gradually spread, often with a mix of persuasion and political convenience. The powerful kings who converted to the new faith would then encourage or even compel their subjects to do the same. This wasn't just a change in spiritual belief, it was a profound cultural shift. The introduction of Christian monasticism brought with it literacy and scholarship, and the monasteries became centers of learning, art, and record-keeping. The Venerable Bede, a monk from Northumbria, wrote his famous ecclesiastical history of the English people during this time, providing us with one of the most important sources for early Anglo-Saxon history. Imagine a single candle being lit in a dark room, and then another and another, until the whole space is softly illuminated. This is how Christianity spread, a slow, flickering light of change across the land. One of the most powerful of these emerging kingdoms was Wessex, located in the south. Its star didn't rise overnight. It was a slow and steady ascent, punctuated by a series of shrewd and successful kings. But its true destiny would be forged in the fire of an entirely new threat. In the late 8th century, a new and terrifying force began to appear on the horizon. The long, sleek ships with their dragon-headed prows belonged to the Vikings, raiders from Scandinavia. Their initial raids were small-scale, hit-and-run attacks on coastal monasteries, which were full of valuable treasures and often poorly defended. The first recorded raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria in 793 sent a shockwave of fear across the land. It was a brutal and unexpected act, and the monks, with their ornate golden crosses and precious manuscripts, were easy targets. But these raids were just the beginning. Over time, the Viking incursions grew in scale and ambition. The great heathen army arrived in the mid-9th century, a force of unprecedented size and organization. They were no longer just looking for loot. They wanted land and conquest. The Heptarchy, which had spent so much time squabbling amongst itself, was ill-prepared for this new, unified threat. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell to the invaders. Northumbria, East Anglia, and most of Mercia were conquered, and their kings either killed or forced to flee. The Vikings established their own territories, a large area in the east and north of England that would become known as the Danelaw, a place where Danish customs and laws prevailed. It seemed as though the dream of an English kingdom was about to be snuffed out before it had even fully ignited. All that stood in the way of complete Viking domination was the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex. Its king, a determined and resourceful man, would soon be known to history as Alfred the Great. His struggle against the Vikings would not just be a fight for a single kingdom, but for the very soul of England itself. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a clash of cultures and wills that would determine the future of the entire island. It was a low point for the English, a moment of profound despair, and from this darkness, a hero would have to emerge. And so, the stage was set for a hero. Alfred of Wessex, a man who would become known as Alfred the Great, inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. His brothers had fought the Vikings before him, but the relentless pressure of the great heathen army was simply too much for any one kingdom to bear alone. When Alfred took the throne in 871, he was faced with a stark reality. The Vikings were everywhere, and his small kingdom was the last Anglo-Saxon bastion standing. The early years of his reign were a brutal cycle of fighting, negotiating, and paying tribute, a strategy of survival more than victory. He fought a series of battles. Some he won, some he lost, but the overwhelming numbers of the Vikings meant that a decisive, final victory seemed impossible. He was a man under immense pressure, and it was a pressure that would define his legacy. The lowest point came in 878. The Vikings, led by the wily Guthrum, launched a surprise winter attack on Alfred's royal court at Chippenham. The attack was so sudden and effective that Alfred was forced to flee into the marshes of Somerset. This was a moment of profound humiliation for a king, a time when his enemies must have believed he was finished. He took refuge in the remote, swampy stronghold of Athelney, a place so isolated and difficult to reach that it offered a perfect hiding spot. It's during this time that a famous legend, perhaps apocryphal but endlessly retold, comes from. The story goes that Alfred, disguised as a common peasant, was given shelter by a farmer's wife and asked to watch some cakes baking on the hearth. Lost in thought about the fate of his kingdom, he let the cakes burn. The angry wife scolded him, completely unaware that she was berating the future king of England. While it's probably not true, it perfectly captures the image of a king brought low, forced to live among his people in the most humble of circumstances. From this low point, Alfred began to rebuild his forces. He sent messengers to the surviving lords of Wessex, summoning them to a secret rendezvous. The men who had been hiding in the woods and hills rallied to their king. In the spring of 878, Alfred and his army emerged from the marshes and met Guthrum's Viking army at the Battle of Edington. This was the moment of truth. The battle was a resounding victory for the Anglo-Saxons, a complete and total rout of the Viking forces. It was a turning point, not just in Alfred's life, but in the history of England. Following the victory, Alfred did something truly remarkable. Instead of simply killing Guthrum, he offered him a peace treaty. He demanded that Guthrum be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself acting as his godfather. This was a masterstroke, a political move that blended military victory with religious diplomacy. The treaty created a formal boundary between Alfred's kingdom of Wessex and the Viking-controlled Danelaw, a clear line drawn in the sand. But Alfred's greatness wasn't just in his military victories, it was in what he did next. He understood that a kingdom could not survive on brute force alone. It needed strong institutions, a sense of shared identity, and a populace that was educated and loyal. He set about a series of far-reaching reforms. He reorganized the army, creating a system of rotational service so that he always had men ready to fight without leaving the fields completely untended. He also ordered the construction of a network of fortified towns, or burhs, strategically placed to defend against further Viking attacks. These burhs were not just military strongholds. They became centers of trade, commerce, and administration, laying the foundation for a more urbanized society. He also understood the importance of a common identity, one that would unite the disparate Anglo-Saxon peoples. He commissioned the translation of important Latin works into Old English, a bold and visionary move that sought to educate his people in their own language. Historians still argue whether Alfred truly intended to create a unified kingdom of all England from the very beginning, or if he was simply a brilliant pragmatist dealing with the immediate threats of his time. What is undeniable is that his actions laid the groundwork for a unified English state. His successors would build upon his foundation, slowly but surely chipping away at the Danelaw and bringing the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under a single crown. Alfred was not just a warrior king, but a scholar, a lawgiver, and a builder. He was, in many ways, the first true king of the English, and his story is the beginning of the long, winding road to a single, unified nation. He took a fragmented, battered land and gave it the tools it needed to survive, and eventually, to thrive. The memory of the burnt cakes may have been a charming fiction, but the legacy of Alfred the Great was very real indeed. With Alfred the Great's death, the heavy lifting of unification fell to his children and grandchildren. The groundwork had been laid, the burrs were built, and the sense of a shared English identity was slowly taking root. But the Danelaw remained a formidable Viking presence in the east. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, proved to be an incredibly effective team, working in concert to chip away at Viking control. Ethelfled was a remarkable figure for her time, a female leader who commanded armies and built fortresses with a skill that matched her father's. Her brother Edward focused on expanding the power of Wessex into the Midlands, while she, from her base in Mercia, pushed into Viking-held territory in the north. Together, they slowly and methodically reconquered the Danelaw, fortress by fortress, town by town. It was a war of attrition, a long and grinding campaign that demanded immense patience and resources. The Viking forces, while still potent, were no longer a unified great army, but a series of smaller, more localized kingdoms that were easier to pick off one by one. The final push for a unified England was led by Edward's son, Athelstan. Historians often refer to him as the first true King of England, as he was the first monarch to rule over a territory that was truly and completely English in its entirety. He wasn't just a king of Wessex, he was a king of the English. Athelstan was a highly ambitious and successful ruler who extended his authority far beyond the borders of what had been Alfred's kingdom. He brought the last remnants of the Viking kingdoms under his control and also asserted his power over the other non-English rulers of the island. In 927, he expelled the last Viking king from York and was declared the first king of all England. His reach was so extensive that he was even recognized by other European monarchs as a major player on the international stage. Athelstan's reign was a high water mark for the early English kingdom, a period of strength and stability that was built directly on the foundation laid by his grandfather. Athelstan's legacy was further cemented at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. This was a massive, bloody battle, a coalition of Viking, Scottish, and Welsh forces against Athelstan's unified English army. The details of the battle are a little murky. Historians still don't agree on its exact location, but the outcome is crystal clear. Athelstan's forces were completely victorious, a triumph celebrated in a famous Old English poem that details the sheer scale and brutality of the fighting. The victory at Brunanburh wasn't just a win. It was a powerful statement to the rest of the island and to Europe that a new unified kingdom had arrived and was here to stay. It solidified England's borders and its identity, creating a sense of national pride and cohesion that had never existed before. Following Athelstan, the reigns of his successors, like Edmund I and Edred continued to consolidate power, creating a strong and centralized government. This period of the mid-10th century was a time of relative peace and stability. The kings of this era were powerful, and the kingdom had a clear structure of governance. The central role of the monarch was becoming more defined, and the bureaucracy needed to run a single kingdom, as opposed to a collection of smaller ones, was beginning to take shape. The English had a single monarch, a single army, and a single vision for their future. This was, in many ways, the golden age of the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, a period of success and prosperity that seemed to promise a long and secure future. One of the key things to remember about this era is the deep connection between the monarchy and the church. The kings were not just temporal rulers, they were seen as divinely appointed protectors of the Christian faith. The church, in turn, provided the administrative and intellectual backbone of the kingdom. Monks and clergy were often the only people who could read and write, and they served as royal scribes, diplomats, and advisors. This symbiotic relationship meant that as the kingdom grew stronger, so too did the church, and vice versa. It was a classic partnership, a power dynamic that would continue to shape the course of English history for centuries to come. The era of the fragmented heptarchy was over, replaced by a single, powerful English kingdom. This was a period of triumph, but as with all things, the seeds of future conflict were already beginning to sprout, just waiting for the right conditions to grow. The strong and unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom, forged by Alfred and his descendants, reached its zenith under a monarch whose very name suggested a new era of calm, King Edgar the Peaceful. He took the throne in 959 and ruled for 16 years, a period of remarkable stability and prosperity that contrasted sharply with the turbulent decades that had preceded it. Edgar's reign was a time of consolidation, not conquest. He didn't have to fight off a massive Viking invasion or reconquer lost territories. Instead, he focused on governing what he had and governing it well. He was a great patron of the monastic reform movement, which sought to revitalize the church and its monasteries, making them centers of learning and strict religious observance once more. This reform had a profound effect on English culture, bringing a new wave of scholarship and art. Imagine the monks meticulously copying manuscripts, illuminating them with vibrant colors and intricate designs, all under the peaceful reign of a king who saw faith and learning as cornerstones of a stable kingdom. Edgar's rule was so successful that he was able to project his power far beyond England's borders through diplomacy rather than warfare. In 973, he held a magnificent coronation ceremony in Bath, a symbolic event that was less about taking the crown and more about demonstrating his power and status to the world. Following this, he went to Chester, where a legendary event took place. He was rowed down the River Dee by a number of other British kings, including the kings of Scotland, Strathclyde, and various Welsh principalities. This was a powerful, if somewhat theatrical, display of his overlordship, a visual representation of the respect he commanded from his neighbors. It was a moment of true imperial swagger for the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, a time when England was not just a kingdom, but a dominant force on the island. This period of peace, however, was also a period of immense change in the daily lives of the people, Edgar's government was highly organized, a sophisticated bureaucracy that was, in many ways, ahead of its time. He standardized coinage across the kingdom, ensuring that a coin minted in Wessex was just as valuable in Northumbria. This simple measure had a huge impact on trade and the economy, making commerce smoother and more reliable. He also oversaw the creation of a clear legal framework, a system of laws that applied to everyone in the kingdom. This legal system was not just about punishment, it was about establishing a sense of justice and order that would hold the kingdom together. The king was no longer just a warrior. He was also the ultimate arbiter of law and justice. But all good things must come to an end, and Edgar's death in 975 marked the end of this golden age. His sons, Edward the Martyr and Ethelred the Unready, squabbled over the succession, leading to a period of political instability. The murder of the young Edward, possibly by agents of his stepmother, plunged the kingdom into a crisis of leadership and trust. His half-brother, Ethelred, inherited the throne at a young age, and his long, troubled reign would prove to be a complete reversal of his father's peaceful era. He would be known to history as the Unready, a mistranslation of an Old English word meaning ill-advised or poorly counseled, which is a pretty apt description of his time on the throne. The late 10th century saw the return of a familiar nightmare, the Vikings. But these were not the opportunistic raiders of Alfred's time. This new wave of Vikings was more organized, more professional, and led by powerful kings from Scandinavia. Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark, and later his son Cnut, launched a series of devastating, large-scale invasions. The English defense was poorly coordinated, often led by incompetent nobles and an indecisive king. Instead of fighting, Ethelred often resorted to a disastrous policy of paying off the Vikings with a tribute known as the Danegeld. This was a short-term solution that only encouraged the Vikings to return for more, like a bully who learns that hitting you gets him a free lunch. It drained the kingdom's treasury and humiliated the population, and it was a policy that historians still point to as one of the great failures of his reign. The kingdom that Edgar had so carefully built on a foundations of peace and order was now unraveling under a new, relentless assault from the North Sea. The stage was being reset for a new struggle for survival. The payment of the Danegeld was a deeply humiliating and utterly ineffective strategy. It was a temporary fix that bled the English kingdom dry, while only encouraging the Danish raiders to return in greater numbers with greater demands. The leader of these new, more serious incursions was Sweyn Forkbeard, a powerful and ambitious king of Denmark. He wasn't just a raider, he was a conqueror. For years, he and his armies harassed the English coastline, but in 1013, he launched a full-scale invasion with the explicit goal of seizing the throne. The English people, tired of their king's incompetence and the constant tribute, were weary. Many lords and towns simply surrendered to Sweyn without a fight. King Ethelred the Unready, having completely lost control of his kingdom, fled to Normandy, seeking refuge with his brother-in-law. For a brief, fleeting moment, Sweyn Forkbeard became the king of England, establishing a new line of Scandinavian rule. But his reign was short-lived. He died just a few weeks after his victory, and the English nobles, in a fit of nostalgia, in desperation, recalled Ethelred from exile. The throne was his again, but the kingdom was more shattered than ever. The true threat, however, was yet to come in the form of Sweyn's son, the legendary Canute the Great. Nut was a brilliant and ruthless leader who returned to England to reclaim his father's crown. He landed in 1015, and the country was plunged into another brutal war. Ethelred died in 1016, and his son, Edmund Ironside, took up the fight. Edmund proved to be a formidable warrior, a stark contrast to his father. He fought a series of bloody battles against Canute, but in the end, the two leaders were forced to a stalemate. They met on an island and agreed to divide the kingdom between them. However, Edmund died shortly after this agreement, leaving Canute as the sole ruler of England. This was a moment of profound change, a new chapter for the island. An Anglo-Saxon king was no longer on the throne. A Dane now wore the crown. Canute's reign, which began in 1016, was surprisingly peaceful and prosperous, a complete departure from the years of warfare and chaos. He proved to be a far more effective ruler than Ethelred had ever been. He didn't rule England as a foreign conqueror. He ruled it as a king who saw the value in a stable, unified kingdom. He respected English law and custom, keeping many of the Anglo-Saxon nobles in their positions and marrying Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, to legitimize his rule. He also divided the kingdom into 4 large earldoms: Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, which would be a major feature of English political life for decades to come. But Canute's ambition extended far beyond England. He was also the king of Denmark, and after a long struggle, the king of Norway. He forged a vast North Sea empire, a powerful collection of kingdoms united under his single, iron-fisted rule. This was a stunning achievement, and for a time, London became the center of a maritime empire that stretched across the northern seas. Historians still marvel at how he managed to maintain control over such a vast and disparate collection of lands and peoples. One of the central things they still debate is how much of a cohesive empire this actually was, or if it was simply a collection of personal unions held together by a single, powerful personality. Regardless, it was a remarkable period of Anglo-Scandinavian rule. Nute's reign also saw the spread of new ideas and cultural exchange between England and Scandinavia. The Danes and English lived side by side, and while there were some tensions, there was also a great deal of integration. The English kingdom was now a key part of a larger Scandinavian world, which had profound effects on trade and politics. Nut, a king who had begun his career as a ruthless Viking warrior, transformed himself into a wise and powerful Christian monarch. A famous story, likely a piece of later propaganda, tells of Canute commanding the tides to recede in order to show his flattering courtiers that a king's power was limited and only God's was absolute. This tale perfectly captures the image of Canute as a king who was both mighty and wise, a far cry from the image of the marauding Viking. But his empire, so dependent on his personal authority, would not last. His death in 1035 plunged the North Sea Empire into chaos, and the English throne was once again up for grabs, leaving the door open for the return of the old Anglo-Saxon royal family. The death of Canute the Great in 1035 shattered his vast North Sea empire. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, squabbled over the succession in England, leading to a period of political chaos and short-lived reigns. Knut's powerful rule had been the glue holding this sprawling empire together, and without him, the pieces quickly flew apart. Harold Harefoot, Knut's illegitimate son, seized the English throne first, but his reign was brief and marked by infighting. When he died in 1040, his half-brother Harthacnut, Knut's legitimate son, with Emma of Normandy, took the throne. Harthacnut was a harsh and unpopular ruler, known for his heavy taxes and cruel policies. He also had a very short reign, dying suddenly in 1042. With both of Knut's sons dead and no clear heir from his line, the English nobles, who were tired of Danish rule and the constant instability, saw a chance to restore the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty. The person they called upon was Edward, a surviving son of the old King Ethelred the Unready, and his wife, Emma of Normandy. Edward had been living in exile in Normandy for most of his life, a guest at the court of the powerful Dukes of Normandy. He was brought back to England and crowned king in 1042, becoming known to history as Edward the Confessor. The Confessor part of his name came from his deep piety and his eventual canonization as a saint, which was a very rare honor for an English monarch. Edward's reign was a time of relative peace and stability, a welcome change after the Viking chaos. He was a devout and gentle man, more interested in religious matters and building Westminster Abbey than in warfare. He was also a king who relied heavily on his advisors, many of whom were Norman friends he had brought with him from France. This reliance on Normans would have profound and lasting consequences. The most powerful man in England during Edward's reign was not the king, but a wealthy and ambitious Anglo-Saxon nobleman named Godwin, Earl of Wessex. Godwin and his family were the true power behind the throne, and their influence grew to be immense. Godwin's daughter, Edith, was married to King Edward, and his sons held key earldoms across the country. The Godwin family essentially ran the kingdom, often at odds with the Norman favorites that Edward had brought over. This created a deep and lasting tension at court, a simmering conflict between the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the new Norman-French influences. At one point, Godwin and his family were even briefly exiled, but they returned in triumph, forcing Edward to restore their lands and positions. The stage was being set for a clash of cultures and power, a struggle for the very soul of the kingdom. Edward the Confessor's long reign, from 1042 to 1066, was successful in its own way. He was a popular king with the common people who appreciated the peace he brought. But his greatest failure, and the one that would lead directly to the end of Anglo-Saxon England, was his childlessness. He and his wife, Edith, had no children. As he grew older and his health began to fail, the question of who would succeed him became the single most important political issue in the kingdom. There were a number of claimants, all with some kind of legitimate, or at least plausible, claim to the throne. The most powerful of these was Harold Godwinson, the son of the powerful Earl Godwin, who was by now the most influential nobleman in England. His claim was based on his status as the most powerful man in the kingdom, and the belief that Edward, on his deathbed, had named him as his successor. But there were two other major contenders. The first was William, Duke of Normandy, a man of immense ambition and military skill. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years before, a claim backed up by the fact that Harold Godwinson himself had once sworn an oath to support William's claim. The circumstances around this oath are a scholarly debate. Was Harold forced to swear it, or did he do so willingly? Either way, William saw it as a binding promise. The third claimant was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a legendary Viking warrior who claimed the throne based on an old agreement between his predecessor and Canut's son. With the sickly king slowly fading, the air in England was thick with political intrigue and the scent of impending war. The year the 1066 was coming, and it would prove to be one of the most fateful years in all of English history. The peaceful reign of Edward the Confessor was a quiet prelude to a storm. The year 1066 stands as one of the most pivotal and dramatic years in English history, a year of crisis, battle, and the end of an era. The long, peaceful reign of Edward the Confessor had come to an end with his death in January, and with it, the political calm that had settled over England was shattered. The throne was empty, and as we remember from the previous section, there were three powerful men who all believed they had the best claim to it. The first to act was Harold Godwinson. He was the most powerful earl in England, the de facto ruler of the country for many years, and according to a number of sources, Edward had named him his successor on his deathbed. The day after Edward's funeral, Harold was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. His claim, however, was contested from the very beginning. Harold's claim was based on a deathbed promise and the support of the English nobles, but it lacked the kind of clear, hereditary link that was preferred at the time. His two rivals, William, Duke of Normandy, and Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, both had what they considered to be stronger claims. William of Normandy, a ruthless and intelligent leader, claimed that King Edward had promised him the throne back in 1051, a promise that Harold had sworn to uphold during a trip to Normandy. Harald Hardrada, on the other hand, was a legendary Viking warrior, a king whose claim was based on an old succession pact between his predecessor and Canute the Great's son. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man whose reputation for ferocity preceded him. The situation was tense. Harold knew that an invasion was coming, but he didn't know from which direction. William was preparing a massive invasion fleet on the coast of Normandy, while Harald Hardrada was amassing his own forces in Scandinavia. Harold's army was positioned in the south, waiting for William's invasion to begin. But it was the north that would see the first major clash. In September, Harald Hardrada, along with Harold Godwinson's estranged brother Tostig, landed in the north of England. The Norwegians were a formidable force, and they quickly defeated a local English army at the Battle of Fulford. Harold Godwinson, upon hearing the news, was forced to make a difficult decision. He marched his army, which was in the south, on an astonishing forced march north. This was an incredible feat of logistics and endurance, covering over 185 miles in just a few days. Harold's army surprised the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, near York. The Norwegians, not expecting an English army to arrive so quickly, had left their armor behind on their ships. The battle was a complete and utter rout. The English army, fueled by a desire to defend their homeland and a furious king, fought with a savage intensity. Harold Hardrada, one of the last great Viking warriors, was killed in the battle, along with Harold's brother Tostig. It was a stunning victory for Harold Godwinson, a moment of triumph that seemed to solidify his place on the throne. He had defeated one of his two major rivals, and the threat from the north was gone. But this victory came at a terrible cost. Just 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, on September 28th, William of Normandy finally landed his forces in Sussex in the south of England. Harold Godwinson, with his army exhausted from a long march and a brutal battle, was forced to turn around and march all the way back south. This second forced march was a military disaster. His troops were tired and his ranks were depleted. He also made the difficult decision to engage William's forces almost immediately, rather than waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Historians still argue whether this was a rash mistake or a calculated risk that simply didn't pay off. The two armies met on October 14th, 1066, on a hill near the town of Hastings. The English army, tired but determined, took up a defensive position on the high ground, forming a famous shield wall that was nearly impenetrable. The Normans, with their cavalry and archers, repeatedly charged the English lines, but the shield wall held firm. The battle was a brutal, all-day affair, a close-quarters melee of immense ferocity. The turning point of the battle came when William's forces used a feigned retreat to break the English lines. As the English soldiers, thinking the Normans were fleeing, charged down the hill, they broke their protective shield wall. The Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them to pieces. In the chaos of the battle, Harold Godwinson was killed, famously said to have been shot through the eye with an arrow. His death broke the morale of the English army, and the Normans were victorious. The Battle of Hastings was over, and with it, Anglo-Saxon England. With Harold Godwinson dead on the battlefield, and his army scattered, the path to the English throne was, in theory, open for William, Duke of Normandy. But it wasn't quite that simple. The Battle of Hastings was a decisive victory, but it didn't immediately grant him the crown. London, the heart of the kingdom, was still held by the remaining English nobles, who proclaimed a new king, Edgar Atheling, a young boy who was the great-nephew of Edward the Confessor and the last male heir of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. William, a realist and a brilliant military strategist, understood that he couldn't simply ride into London and expect to be crowned. He knew that the English people, while defeated, were not yet broken. Instead of a direct assault, William began a methodical and brutal campaign of conquest and intimidation. He marched his army through the southeast, burning towns and villages as he went, a terrifying display of force designed to break the will of the English people. He cut off London from its supply lines, making it clear that the city could not hold out for long. The remaining English leadership, seeing the futility of resistance and the utter devastation being wrought upon their lands, eventually rode out to meet William and offered him the crown. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, the very same place where Harold had been crowned just months before. It was a symbolic moment, a powerful statement that a new era had begun. But the conquest was far from over. William's new kingdom was a deeply rebellious one, and his reign would be a long, brutal campaign of consolidation. English nobles and peasants alike rose up in revolt, especially in the north. The rebellions were scattered and uncoordinated, but they were a constant thorn in William's side. The most famous of these was the harrying of the north in 1069-1070. William, in a fit of cold, calculated fury, ordered a systematic campaign of scorched earth. His armies burned crops, killed livestock, and destroyed villages across a vast swathe of northern England. The goal wasn't just to defeat the rebels, but to make the land uninhabitable, to starve them into submission, and ensure that the North could never again rise against him. This was a brutal, shocking display of power, an act of almost unimaginable cruelty that would leave a scar on the land and the memory of the English people for generations. Historians still argue about the exact death toll, but the consensus is that it was immense, a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing that cemented William's control and his terrifying reputation. To ensure his rule was permanent, William implemented a radical overhaul of English society. He confiscated the lands of the English nobles who had fought against him, and he granted these vast estates to his Norman followers. This wasn't just a political move, it was a complete replacement of the old aristocracy with a new, French-speaking elite. The English language, the English court, and the English system of governance were all pushed aside, replaced by Norman French and a new way of doing things. This sudden shift created a deep cultural and linguistic divide between the ruling class and the common people. The feudal system, a structure of land ownership and loyalty that existed in Normandy, was imposed on England. The king owned all the land, and he granted it to his most powerful nobles, or barons, in exchange for their military service. The barons, in turn, granted land to lesser knights, and so on, all the way down to the peasants, who were tied to the land and the lord who owned it. This new system created a rigid social hierarchy, a chain of loyalty that all flowed back to the king. It was a highly effective way of ensuring control and loyalty, but it also meant that the old Anglo-Saxon way of life was essentially erased. The conquest wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a change in everything. William had come, he had seen, and he had utterly conquered, reshaping England in his own image. The conquest of England was a monumental undertaking, but for William the Conqueror, it was only the beginning. Ruling a kingdom of rebellious subjects and land-hungry Norman barons required not just military might, but a genius for administration and control. He understood that to truly master his new kingdom, he needed to know exactly what he had. And so, in 1085, he commissioned one of the most remarkable documents of the Middle Ages, the Domesday Book. Imagine teams of royal commissioners riding on horseback from village to village across the entire country, asking the same questions in every single place. What was the name of the manor? Who owned it? How many peasants lived there? How many plows did they have? How much woodland, meadow, and pasture was there? How many mills and fisheries? The Domesday Book was in effect a massive, comprehensive survey of every inch of his new realm. The purpose of this survey was twofold. First, it was a tax roll. William wanted to know exactly how much his new kingdom was worth, so he could tax it accordingly. It was a way to ensure he got every penny that was owed to him. Second, it was a record of ownership. The Domesday Book was the ultimate legal document, a definitive list of who owned what. If there was a dispute over a piece of land, the Domesday Book was the final word. Its name, Domesday, comes from the Old English word for doom or judgment, because its judgment was final and unappealable, just like the last judgment of God. It was a testament to William's power, a tool of state control that no English king had ever possessed before. But the Domesday Book was just one part of a larger system that William imposed on England, feudalism. We mentioned this in the last section, but it's worth a closer look because it was a complete restructuring of society. Feudalism was a system based on land and loyalty. The king was at the top, the ultimate owner of all land in the kingdom. He granted large chunks of that land, known as fiefs, to his most powerful Norman followers, his barons or tenants-in-chief. In exchange for this land, the barons swore an oath of loyalty to the king and promised to provide him with a certain number of knights for his army. The barons, in turn, granted some of their land to lesser lords and knights, who also swore oaths of loyalty and promised military service. At the bottom of this pyramid were the vast majority of the population, the peasants or serfs. They were not slaves, but they were tied to the land and to the lord who owned it. They worked the land in exchange for a small plot of their own and the lord's protection. This system was a brilliant way for William to maintain control over a conquered people. The loyalty of the barons was tied directly to their wealth and power. If a baron rebelled, William could simply confiscate his land and give it to someone else. It created a rigid, hierarchical society where everyone knew their place and their duty. The Norman barons built castles across the country, not just as homes, but as symbols of their power and as military strongholds to keep the English population in check. These stone fortresses, with their high walls and moats, were a physical manifestation of Norman dominance, a constant reminder to the English that their world had been irrevocably changed. The Norman conquest also had a profound impact on the English language. Before 1066, the language was a Germanic tongue known as Old English. After the conquest, the ruling class spoke Norman French. For the next several centuries, England was a bilingual country. French was the language of the court, the law, and the nobility, while English was the language of the common people. Over time, the two languages began to mix, with thousands of French words entering the English vocabulary. Words for law and government, like court, justice, government, and words for food, like beef, pork, venison, came from French, while the names of the animals themselves, cow, pig, deer, remained English. It's a fascinating linguistic quirk that shows the deep, lasting impact of the Norman conquest. A conquered nation's language was slowly and surely absorbing the language of its new masters. With William the Conqueror's death in 1087, the great work of the conquest was done, but the question of succession immediately plunged the kingdom into a new kind of turmoil. The Conqueror had 3 sons, Robert Curthose, William Rufus, and Henry. According to Norman custom, the eldest son, Robert, was meant to inherit Normandy, while William Rufus was granted the more recently conquered and therefore more difficult to control, Kingdom of England. This split created an immediate rivalry, with many of the Norman barons holding lands on both sides of the Channel. Their loyalty was now divided between two different masters, and a power struggle was inevitable. William II, known as William Rufus for his ruddy complexion, was a decisive and often ruthless king, much like his father. He was a formidable warrior and an effective, if unpopular, ruler. His reign was dominated by constant warfare against his older brother Robert and his efforts to expand his power. He also had a famously strained relationship with the Church, particularly with the great Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm. The two men clashed over the rights and powers of the Church, a conflict that would become a recurring theme in medieval English history. But William II's reign was cut short in a famously mysterious incident in 1100. He was out hunting in the New Forest, a vast ancient woodland that his father had created by clearing land and displacing villagers. A man named Walter Tyrrell shot an arrow that struck and killed the king. The exact circumstances of his death are a subject of much scholarly debate. Was it an accident, a political assassination, a family conspiracy? We will never truly know. Walter Tyrrell immediately fled, and William's younger brother, Henry, who was also hunting in the forest that day, wasted no time. He rode straight to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned king just 3 days later. He was a man who understood the importance of acting quickly. Henry I, a man of intellect and cunning, was a very different king from his boorish warrior brother. He was known as the Lion of Justice for his commitment to a strong and efficient system of law and administration. His goal was to consolidate royal power and to ensure that his kingdom was stable and prosperous. He strengthened the royal administration, creating a system of professional bureaucrats and a powerful royal court that was separate from the personal influence of his barons. This was a significant step toward a modern centralized state. He also took the clever step of marrying Matilda of Scotland, a woman who was a descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon royal family. This marriage was a powerful political statement, an attempt to bridge the divide between the Norman ruling class and the English population, and to legitimize his rule. One of Henry's greatest achievements was the successful conclusion of his long conflict with his brother Robert Curthose for control of Normandy. In 1106, Henry decisively defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray, capturing his brother and imprisoning him for the rest of his life. This victory reunited England and Normandy under a single ruler, just as it had been under William the Conqueror. Henry's reign was a period of relative peace and stability, a time when the new Norman institutions of governance and law were able to take root and flourish. He was a ruthless politician and a stern ruler, but he brought an order and a sense of justice that the kingdom desperately needed after the turbulent reign of his brother. His great tragedy, however, was the loss of his only legitimate son, William Adelin, in a shipwreck known as the White Ship Disaster. This single event would plunge the kingdom into a new, even more devastating crisis of succession upon his death. Henry I's death in 1135 plunged England into a new and devastating civil war, a period so chaotic and brutal it would be forever known as the Anarchy. The problem, as we remember, was the loss of his only legitimate son, William Adelin, in the White Ship disaster. Henry had been a master of control, but he couldn't control fate. Before his death, he had desperately tried to secure the succession for his daughter Matilda, the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor and now the wife of Geoffrey of Anjou. He had made his barons swear a solemn oath to support her as queen. A number of them, however, felt that a woman could not rule, and when Henry died, they broke their oath. The person they supported was Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Stephen was a popular and well-liked man, a charismatic figure who was also a great-grandson of William the Conqueror. With the support of many powerful barons and the church, he was quickly crowned king. But Matilda would not be denied. She had the backing of her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, a formidable military leader and one of the most powerful men in England. In 1139, she invaded England, and the Civil War began in earnest. The kingdom was torn in two, with supporters of Stephen and supporters of Matilda fighting a long and bloody conflict that would last for nearly 2 decades. The war was less a series of grand battles and more a grinding, constant struggle of sieges, raids, and local skirmishes. The central authority of the crown collapsed, and the barons, with no strong king to hold them in check, seized the opportunity to build their own private castles and wage their own personal wars. The famous Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described the period with a grim intensity, writing that Christ and his saints slept during this time. The war had a devastating effect on the lives of ordinary people. Without a strong central government, law and order broke down completely. Bands of armed men, loyal to one lord or the other, roamed the countryside, extorting money, burning crops, and terrorizing the population. The chroniclers of the time described the atrocities in vivid detail. Men and women were hung up by their thumbs, their feet were burned, and they were thrown into dungeons with snakes and toads. The castles, which were supposed to be places of protection, became centers of tyranny and brutality. This was a dark age within the Middle Ages, a time when the strong preyed upon the weak, and the very idea of a king's justice seemed to vanish. Stephen, while a good man in many respects, simply did not have the authority or the resources to put a stop to the chaos. The balance of power shifted back and forth. Matilda's forces captured Stephen in 1141 at the Battle of Lincoln, and she was briefly recognized as queen. But her short time in power was disastrous. She was imperious and arrogant, and she quickly alienated the people of London. She was forced to flee the city in a famous escape, riding away on horseback at night. Stephen was later exchanged for Robert of Gloucester, and the war dragged on. It was a stalemate, a conflict with no end in sight. The country was exhausted, the treasury was empty, and the great work of building a strong, unified kingdom, which had begun with Alfred and was consolidated by Henry I, was in danger of being completely undone. But a solution was slowly emerging from the ruins. Matilda's son, Henry, was growing up in Anjou, and he was proving to be a highly capable leader in his own right. He began to make his own incursions into England, and by the 1150s, he was a serious threat. A final decisive battle seemed inevitable, but the English barons, tired of the endless war, brokered a peace. In 1153, Stephen's own son and heir died, and the weary king, seeing no point in continuing the fight, agreed to the Treaty of Wallingford. The terms were simple. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the throne would pass not to his remaining son, but to Matilda's son, Henry. The anarchy was over, and a new dynasty was about to begin. Stephen died the very next year, and Henry Plantagenet became King Henry II, a monarch who would bring a new kind of order to England and rule a vast, sprawling empire. The long nightmare of the anarchy had come to an end, but the scars would take a long time to heal. Henry II, the son of Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou, inherited the English throne in 1154 and immediately set about the monumental task of restoring order to a kingdom shattered by 2 decades of civil war. He was a new kind of king, a man of immense energy and intellect, a stark contrast to the indecisive Stephen. Known as the first of the Plantagenet dynasty, he was a man who lived up to his family name, a nickname derived from his father's habit of wearing a sprig of broom flowers, or planta genista, in his cap. Henry's rule was defined by his immense ambition and a legalistic mind. His first priority was to re-establish royal authority. He demolished the unlicensed castles that had sprung up during the anarchy, reasserted his control over the royal revenues, and restored the royal courts. He was a whirlwind of activity, constantly on the move, personally overseeing the affairs of his vast and sprawling empire. This empire, the Angevin Empire, was truly staggering in its size and complexity. Henry's lands were not just England. He was also the Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, the Count of Anjou, and through his marriage to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, he ruled over a vast swathe of western France. His territory stretched from the Scottish border all the way to the Pyrenees. He was, in effect, a more powerful ruler on the continent than the King of France himself, and this created a constant, simmering tension between the two monarchs. Ruling such a large and geographically disparate collection of lands was a constant challenge, a logistical nightmare that required Henry to be in a perpetual state of travel, forever crossing the Channel to put out fires and assert his authority. Henry's most lasting legacy, however, was in the field of law. He was a great legal reformer, and his innovations would have a profound and lasting impact on the English legal system. He established a system of royal justices who traveled the country, bringing the king's law to the local level. This was a crucial step in creating a uniform system of justice, a common law that applied to everyone, everywhere in the kingdom. Before this, local justice had been a confusing patchwork of regional customs and traditions. Henry also introduced the use of the jury, a system where a group of 12 local men were called upon to give evidence and decide cases. This was a revolutionary idea, a move that gave ordinary people a role in the justice system and helped to restore faith in the rule of law. But Henry's reforms were not without their challenges. His ambition to bring all subjects under his legal authority led to a bitter and legendary conflict with the Church. The central issue was whether clergy who committed crimes should be tried in the king's courts or in the Church's own ecclesiastical courts. The Church argued that its clergy were not subject to the king's jurisdiction, a position known as benefit of clergy. Henry, with his desire for a uniform system of law, saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. This conflict came to a head with his own Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. Henry and Becket had once been close friends. Henry had appointed him to the position, believing he would be a loyal ally who would help him curb the power of the church. He couldn't have been more wrong. Once Becket became archbishop, he underwent a complete transformation, becoming a fierce defender of the church's rights. The struggle between the two men was long and acrimonious, a classic power struggle between church and state. It culminated in a moment of shocking drama. Henry, in a fit of rage, famously cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his knights, taking his words literally, rode to Canterbury and brutally murdered Becket in his own cathedral. The murder of the archbishop was a public relations disaster for Henry, an act of sacrilege that sent shockwaves across Europe. He was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot to Becket's tomb and being scourged by the monks. The king had been forced to bend the knee to the power of the church, a lesson that no monarch could ever be truly absolute. The murder of Thomas Becket was a monumental public relations disaster for Henry II, a moment of profound crisis that forced him to change his tactics. While he never fully abandoned his legal reforms, the king learned a painful lesson about the limits of his power, especially in the face of the church. His later reign was dominated not by his battles with the clergy, but by his struggles with his own family. Henry II and his wife, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, had 4 sons: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. These were not the kind of sons who were content to wait for their turn. They were ambitious, hot-tempered, and constantly at odds with their father and with each other. Eleanor, a powerful woman in her own right, famously encouraged their rebellions, a move that led Henry to have her imprisoned for a number of years. The family drama was a constant source of political instability, a swirling vortex of backstabbing and betrayal that consumed the king's final years. The next king would be Henry's 3rd son, Richard, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. He inherited the throne in 1189 after a long period of rebellion against his father. Richard was a very different king from his pragmatic, legalistic father. He was a quintessential knight king, a man who saw his destiny not in the dry administration of justice, but on the battlefield. He was a brilliant military commander, a charismatic warrior who was obsessed with the idea of the Crusades, a holy war to recapture the city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. He saw his reign as a chance to fulfill a religious and knightly duty, a chance to win glory and honor for himself and for God. Richard's reign was almost entirely spent abroad. He was in England for only about 6 months of his 10-year rule. The rest of his time was spent fighting in the Holy Land, fighting to defend his French territories or in captivity. He was a legendary figure, known for his bravery and his military prowess. He was a formidable warrior on the field, and his reputation spread across Europe and even into the Muslim world. His most famous rival was the great Sultan Saladin, and the two men fought a long, bitter campaign for control of the Holy Land. The Third Crusade, led by Richard, was a mixed success. He recaptured some key coastal cities, but he was ultimately unable to take Jerusalem. He made a truce with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the city, a pragmatic compromise that disappointed many of his more fervent followers. On his way back from the crusade, Richard's luck ran out. He was captured by Leopold V, Duke of Austria, a man he had deeply offended Saul on the crusade. Leopold held him for ransom and handed him over to his own overlord, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. This was an astonishing turn of events. The King of England, a man of immense power, was being held captive in a remote castle in Germany. The ransom demanded was staggering, 150,000 marks, a sum that was twice the annual revenue of the English crown. To raise the money, Richard's officials had to impose a deeply unpopular tax on every person in the kingdom, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant. This was the first time that a king had ever asked his subjects to pay for his personal freedom, and it was a heavy burden that would have lasting political consequences. While Richard was away, his younger brother, John, made a series of cynical and self-serving moves, seizing power and even conspiring with the King of France against his own brother. This was the treacherous Prince John of Robin Hood fame, and the popular image of him is not entirely unfounded. Richard eventually returned to England, forgave John, and spent the rest of his reign fighting to defend his French territories against the cunning King Philip II of France. He died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a small castle. Richard the Lionheart was a great warrior, but his absence from England created a power vacuum and a financial crisis that would be left for his younger brother to clean up. His was a romantic but largely absent reign, one that set the stage for the dramatic and ultimately disastrous rule of his successor. Following the death of his legendary brother, Richard the Lionheart, the crown passed to John, the youngest of Henry II's sons. John's reign, which began in 1199, is one of the most troubled and consequential in English history. Unlike his celebrated brother, John was not a great warrior, and his rule was a string of military defeats and political blunders. His nickname, Lackland, came from the fact that he was the only son of Henry II who didn't inherit a title and land in his own right, but it also became a cruel joke on his later failures. His reign was a perfect storm of disastrous leadership, mounting debt, and a powerful and increasingly defiant nobility. John's first major problem was the loss of Normandy. His main rival, Philip II of France, was a cunning and ambitious king who saw John's weakness as an opportunity. Philip launched a series of military campaigns, and John, with his lack of military skill and the desertion of many of his barons, was simply unable to hold on to his French territories. In a stunning series of defeats, John lost almost all of the Angevin Empire in France, a vast territory that had been in his family for over 100 years. The loss of Normandy was a devastating blow to the prestige of the English crown and a source of deep resentment among the barons, who had lands on both sides of the Channel. It meant that the English nobility was now forced to focus all of its attention on England itself rather than on its continental holdings. To make matters worse, John was locked in a long and bitter conflict with the Church. The dispute began over the appointment of the new Archbishop of Canterbury. John wanted his own man, but Pope Innocent III insisted on his own candidate, Stephen Langton. John, in a fit of stubbornness, refused to accept the Pope's choice, and in response, the Pope placed England under an interdict. This was a powerful spiritual weapon that meant no church services, no baptisms, and no Christian burials could take place in England. It was a complete spiritual lockdown, and it turned the English people against their king. John was eventually excommunicated, a stunning public humiliation for a king. He was finally forced to back down and accept the Pope's authority, but the damage to his reputation was done. But John's greatest challenge came from his own barons. His military failures and high taxes, a necessity to fund his constant wars, had created a deep and lasting resentment. He was a ruthless and suspicious king, and his subjects lived in constant fear of his arbitrary justice. The barons, pushed to their breaking point, rose up in open rebellion. They were no longer willing to accept a king who was so inept and so tyrannical. Their goal was not to depose the king, but to force him to agree to a set of rules that would limit his power and protect their rights. They wanted a king who was subject to the law, not a king who was above it. In 1215, the rebel barons marched on London and seized control of the city. John, with no military support and no one to turn to, was forced to negotiate. They met on a meadow by the River Thames at a place called Runnymede. On June 15, 1215, John grudgingly affixed his royal seal to a Charter of Liberties, a document that would become known to history as the Magna Carta. The Great Charter was a landmark document, a foundational text of Western democracy. It wasn't intended to be a document for the common people. It was a list of demands from a group of powerful barons. But its principles were revolutionary. It established the idea that no one, not even the king, was above the law. It promised that free men would not be imprisoned or stripped of their possessions without due process of law, a principle that would eventually evolve into the right to a fair trial. The Magna Carta was a powerful check on absolute power, a document that forced a king to admit that his authority had limits. While John immediately tried to have it annulled, and a civil war known as the First Barons' War ensued, the principles of the Charter would endure, a beacon of justice in the centuries to come. The death of King John in 1216, in the middle of a civil war, did not immediately bring peace to the kingdom. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited a country in chaos, with a French prince, Louis, supported by many of the barons, controlling half the kingdom. It was a perilous time for the young king and the future of the Plantagenet dynasty. A council of loyal regents, led by the legendary knight William Marshal, took up the fight on Henry's behalf. Marshal was a brilliant and honorable man, and he was able to win over many of the wavering barons. He reissued the Magna Carta, a powerful gesture of goodwill that showed the new regime was willing to abide by the principles that John had so bitterly fought against. The tide of the war slowly began to turn, and by 1217, the French prince had been defeated and was forced to withdraw. William Marshal's leadership had saved the Plantagenet dynasty, and Henry III was now, at last, the undisputed King of England. But Henry's long reign, from 1216 to 1272, was far from peaceful. He was a devout and cultured man, but he was also a weak and ineffective ruler. He was obsessed with the idea of a new crusade and with his family's lost French territories. This obsession led him to spend vast sums of money on military campaigns that were consistently a failure. To make matters worse, he was also deeply influenced by his wife, Eleanor of Provence, and her many relatives who came to England to seek their fortune. These foreign favorites were given positions of power and wealth, which infuriated the English barons, who felt they were being shut out of the government. The resentment against the king's arbitrary rule and his foreign friends grew steadily throughout his reign. The culmination of this discontent was a major rebellion led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. De Montfort was a formidable and charismatic figure, a French nobleman who had become a leading English baron. He was married to the king's sister and was, in many ways, an insider. In 1258, de Montfort and a group of other powerful barons forced Henry to agree to the provisions of Oxford. This was a revolutionary document that, in effect, stripped the king of his power and placed the government in the hands of a council of barons. It was a bold and unprecedented move, a direct challenge to the authority of the crown. The provisions of Oxford were a major step toward constitutional monarchy, a direct evolution of the principles laid out in the Magna Carta. But the barons' rule did not last. The coalition fell apart, and a civil war, known as the Second Barons' War, broke out. In 1264, Simon de Montfort and his forces defeated the king at the Battle of Lewes, and Henry III was captured. De Montfort was now the de facto ruler of England. To legitimize his rule, he did something that would have a lasting impact on English history. In 1265, he called a new kind of assembly, a parliament that included not only the barons and clergy, but also elected representatives from the towns and shires. This was a groundbreaking moment, a crucial step in the development of the institution we know as Parliament. It was the first time that commoners had a voice in the national government, a revolutionary idea that gave the assembly a broader base of support. De Montfort's time in power was short-lived, however. He was a ruthless ruler, and his personal ambition alienated many of his former allies. The king's son, the future Edward III, escaped from captivity and raised an army. In 1265, Edward defeated and killed de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham, bringing the Civil War to an end. Henry III was restored to the throne, but the political landscape of England had been forever changed. The idea of a parliament, an assembly that could represent the interests of the kingdom and check the power of the king, had been born. It was an institution that would endure, a legacy of a period of profound political turmoil that would define the relationship between the monarch and the people for centuries to come. The death of Simon de Montfort and the restoration of Henry III brought a new sense of order to the kingdom, but the political lessons of the Second Barons' War were not forgotten. When Henry III died in 1272, his son, Edward I, was already a formidable figure, a battle-hardened warrior who had proven his military skill during the rebellion. Edward was a completely different kind of king from his gentle and ineffective father. He was a man of immense ambition, a master of administration, and a stern, sometimes ruthless ruler. His long reign, from 1272 to 1307, would be defined by his relentless pursuit of a strong, unified, and powerful English kingdom. He was a king who believed in the power of law and in the importance of a clear, structured government. Edward's first major military goal was the conquest of Wales. Wales was not a single, unified country, but a collection of independent principalities, and their leaders had long been a thorn in the side of the English crown. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the Prince of Wales, was a particularly defiant figure who refused to pay homage to the new English king. This was a direct challenge to Edward's authority, and he was not a king who tolerated such a challenge. In 1277, Edward launched his first major military campaign into Wales. It was a well-planned and highly effective invasion, with Edward's army moving swiftly and methodically to crush Welsh resistance. Llywelyn was forced to surrender and accept a peace treaty that stripped him of most of his territory. But the peace was short-lived. A few years later, Llywelyn's brother Dafydd led a new, even more widespread rebellion. Edward's response was swift and brutal. He launched a second, even larger invasion in 1282, and this time his goal was not just to defeat the Welsh, but to conquer and annex the entire country. The English army, with its superior numbers and technology, was unstoppable. Llywelyn was killed in a skirmish, and with his death, the heart of the Welsh resistance was broken. The last holdouts were crushed, and Edward set about the task of turning Wales into an English principality. His legacy in Wales is a mix of legal reform and brutal conquest. He introduced English law and administration, but he also built a series of magnificent, imposing stone castles, a ring of iron, to keep the Welsh people in check. Castles like Caernarfon, Harlech, and Conwy were not just defensive fortresses. They were symbols of English power, a physical manifestation of a foreign conqueror's control. In 1301, Edward the Verusers made a powerful symbolic gesture by naming his own son, the future Edward II, as the first Prince of Wales, a title that has been held by the heir to the English throne ever since. This was a declaration that Wales was no longer an independent country but a part of the English kingdom. Edward III's conquest of Wales was a military triumph, but it was also a cultural one. English rule was established, and the Welsh people were forced to adapt to a new reality. Historians still argue whether Edward's actions were necessary to secure the peace of the realm, or were simply a ruthless act of imperial expansion. What is undeniable is that his conquest forever changed the relationship between England and Wales, a bond forged in fire and rebellion. But Edward's ambitions were not limited to Wales. He also had his eye on Scotland. His campaigns there would prove to be a much more difficult and costly undertaking, a long and brutal conflict that would come to define the final years of his reign. His success in Wales was a testament to his military genius, but his failures in Scotland would be a reminder that some people, when pushed to the limit, will never truly be conquered. The stage was set for a new and even more bitter war, a struggle for the soul of the island itself, and it would pit the mighty King of England against a legendary Scottish hero. With Wales firmly under his control, Edward I turned his attention north to Scotland. The situation there presented a different kind of challenge. Unlike the fragmented Welsh principalities, Scotland was a unified kingdom, but it was now facing a succession crisis. The death of King Alexander III in 1286, and then the death of his heir, the young Maid of Norway, left the Scottish throne empty. A number of powerful Scottish noblemen all claimed the crown. The Scots, in a clever but ultimately disastrous move, invited Edward I to arbitrate their dispute, hoping he would be an impartial judge. Edward, ever the opportunist, seized the chance to assert his overlordship. He chose John Balliol as king, but only after forcing him to swear fealty, an act that made him a puppet king of England. This was not a situation that the proud Scottish people were going to tolerate for long. Edward I's heavy-handed rule over Scotland, his constant demands for men and money to fund his wars in France, and his general lack of respect for Scottish customs led to a furious backlash. The Scottish nobles, led by John Balliol, eventually renounced their fealty and allied themselves with France, a move that would lead to a long and brutal war. In 1296, Edward I launched a massive invasion, crushing the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar and forcing John Balliol to abdicate. He removed the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of the Scottish kings, and had it brought to Westminster Abbey as a powerful symbol of his conquest. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the Scottish nation, but the conquest was not complete. The Scottish people, refusing to accept English rule, rose up in rebellion. The leader of this popular uprising was a man of humble origins who would become a legendary hero, William Wallace. Wallace was not a nobleman, but a charismatic warrior who was able to rally the common people to his cause. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, using hit-and-run tactics to frustrate and demoralize the English forces. His most famous victory came in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where his small army of foot soldiers, using the narrow bridge to their advantage, completely routed a much larger English force of armored knights. It was a stunning triumph, a moment that proved the English were not invincible. Wallace was briefly declared Guardian of Scotland, a moment of national pride that would forever cement his place in Scottish history. Edward I, infuriated by the setback, led an even larger army north. In 1298, he met Wallace's forces at the Battle of Falkirk. This time, Edward's army was better prepared, and his longbowmen, a new and devastating weapon, decimated Wallace's shield wall. The Scottish army was defeated, and Wallace was forced to go into hiding. For 7 years, he was a fugitive, a symbol of Scottish resistance, but in 1305, he was betrayed and captured. Edward I, determined to make an example of him, had him brought to London, where he was put on trial for treason and was executed in a long and gruesome manner. His body parts were sent to different parts of the country as a warning, a brutal display of a conqueror's power. The execution of Wallace, however, did not break the Scottish spirit. Instead, it only fanned the flames of rebellion. A new hero emerged, Robert the Bruce, a powerful Scottish nobleman who had previously been a rival of Wallace. Bruce had himself crowned King of Scotland, and he resumed the war for independence. Edward III, now an old and ailing man, launched one final campaign to crush the Scots once and for all. He died on the way, his last breath spent on his obsession with conquering Scotland. His son, Edward II, inherited the throne and the war, but he was a very different king, and the tide of the conflict was about to turn. The long and bitter wars with Scotland would continue for many years, a tragic, bloody affair that created a deep and lasting animosity between the two kingdoms. The death of Edward I on the way to Scotland in 1307 left the burden of a deeply unpopular and costly war to his son, Edward II. This was a man who, in almost every way, was the polar opposite of his powerful and ambitious father. Edward II was a weak and indecisive king, more interested in jousting and courtly entertainment than in the brutal business of governance and warfare. He had a number of personal friendships with male courtiers, most notably Piers Gaveston, that led to a great deal of controversy and resentment among the powerful English barons. The barons felt that these men were exerting too much influence over the king and that the affairs of the kingdom were being neglected. This was a classic medieval political problem. A king who was seen as being under the thumb of unpopular favorites. Edward's reign was a constant series of political clashes with his barons. They repeatedly tried to limit his power, forcing him to accept a series of reforms known as the Ordinances of 1311, which effectively transferred much of the royal authority to a council of barons. They even went so far as to exile and eventually execute Piers Gaveston, a move that the king never forgave. But the most significant event of his reign was a military disaster that would forever cement his reputation as a failed king. In 1314, Edward led a large English army into Scotland to relieve the siege of Stirling Castle. Robert the Bruce, the new king of Scotland, met him at the Battle of Bannockburn. The Battle of Bannockburn was a complete and utter rout for the English. Robert the Bruce, a brilliant military strategist, chose his ground carefully, forcing the English army to fight on a narrow, boggy battlefield where their superior numbers and heavy cavalry were rendered useless. The Scottish pikemen, in their tightly packed formations, were like a wall of spears that the English knights could not break. The defeat was a national humiliation for England and a glorious victory for the Scots, a moment that secured their independence for centuries to come. It was a brutal lesson for Edward, a lesson that he seemed completely incapable of learning. With his reputation in tatters and his power at an all-time low, Edward II's reign descended into further chaos. He eventually replaced Gaveston with a new, equally unpopular favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. The barons once again rose up in rebellion, but this time the rebellion was led by a surprising figure, Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella. Isabella, a daughter of the King of France, had been humiliated and sidelined by her husband and his favorites. She fled to France, and there she began an affair with a powerful exiled English baron, Roger Mortimer. Together, they formed a coalition to depose the king. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England. The invasion was a stunning success. The English people and the barons, tired of Edward's inept rule and his unpopular favorites, flocked to her banner. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed, and Edward II himself was captured and imprisoned. In a move that was extremely rare in medieval England, the king was officially deposed by Parliament, and his young son, Edward III, was crowned in his place. The fate of Edward II is a subject of much historical debate. It is widely believed that he was murdered in Berkeley Castle in 1327 on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer, a terrifying act of regicide that sent a powerful warning to any future monarch. The story of his supposed murder with a red-hot poker is a piece of historical lore that, while likely untrue, perfectly captures the dark and brutal nature of his final days. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents for a few years, but their power was short-lived. A new, more ambitious king was waiting in the wings, ready to take control of his own kingdom. The deposition of Edward II and the regency of his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, was a period of fragile and unpopular rule. The young king, Edward III, was crowned at just 14 years old, and for a few years he was a king in name only. Real power lay with Isabella and Mortimer, and their rule was as self-serving and corrupt as the one they had overthrown. But the young king was not going to be a puppet for long. At the age of 17, in 1330, Edward III launched a coup. He and a small group of loyal men snuck into Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel, captured Mortimer, and had him executed for treason. Edward then had his own mother, Isabella, exiled to a quiet life in a castle. It was a decisive and ruthless move, a powerful statement that a new, more ambitious king had arrived. The stage was now set for one of the most consequential reigns in English history, a reign that would be defined by a long and devastating conflict with France. Edward III's claim to the French throne was a complicated and, to be honest, a bit of a flimsy one. The French king, Charles IV, had died in 1328 without a male heir. The French nobility, citing their own Salic law, which forbade inheritance through the female line, chose a distant cousin, Philip VI, as their new king. But Edward III was the son of Charles the Facult's sister, Isabella, and he argued that he had a better hereditary claim to the throne. His claim was based on a principle of legal inheritance that was not recognized in France, but it was a claim he was willing to fight for. While the succession crisis was the immediate cause, the real reasons for the war were more complex and deeply rooted. The two kingdoms were long-standing rivals, constantly fighting over control of the rich wool trade with Flanders and over the remaining English territories in France, most notably the Duchy of Aquitaine. In 1337, Edward III launched his campaign, and with that, the 100 Years' War officially began. It was not a single, continuous war, but a long series of conflicts punctuated by truces and short periods of peace that would last for over a century. The English strategy was simple. They would use their superior archers and disciplined infantry to defeat the French in open battle, and then use their victories to pressure the French king. The early years of the war saw a series of stunning English victories. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was a decisive triumph. The English longbowmen, with their rapid rate of fire, were able to decimate the charging French knights before they even reached the English lines. The French nobility, with their old-fashioned chivalric style of warfare, were no match for the new English tactics. This victory was followed 10 years later by another one at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the English, led by Edward's son, the legendary Black Prince, captured the French king himself. The English were now at the height of their power. They had captured the French king, and they controlled large parts of France. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 was a moment of peak English dominance, granting them vast territories in France in exchange for Edward renouncing his claim to the French throne. But the treaty was never fully ratified, and the war was far from over. The 100 Years' War was a massive financial burden on England. It required constant taxation and a huge investment in men and resources. To secure the money and the political support he needed, Edward III relied heavily on Parliament. The war gave Parliament a new sense of purpose and power. The king needed their money, and in return they were able to demand more rights and a greater say in the governance of the kingdom. This was a crucial step in the evolution of Parliament, a time when it became an indispensable part of the English government. The war also had a profound effect on English national identity. The shared experience of fighting against a common French enemy helped to forge a new sense of patriotism and pride. English, which had been the language of the common people, began to replace French as the language of the court and the law. The 100 Years' War, for all its brutality and cost, was a crucible in which a new, more confident English identity was forged. But just as the war was reaching its climax, a new, more terrifying enemy was on its way, a silent, invisible foe that would change the course of European history forever. The mid-14th century, a time of grand military campaigns and royal ambition, was suddenly and violently interrupted by an invisible enemy. The Black Death, a devastating pandemic caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, swept across Europe, arriving in England in 1348. The plague, carried by fleas on black rats, spread with terrifying speed and ferocity, and within a few short years, it had decimated the population. Historians still debate the exact death toll, but the consensus is that somewhere between a third and a half of the population perished. For a kingdom that had been at the height of its power, this was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The war with France was abruptly halted, not by a treaty, but by the sheer impossibility of raising an army in a land where a third of the fighting men were now dead. Imagine a country where entire villages were wiped out, where fields lay unplowed, and where there were not enough people to harvest the crops. The psychological impact was immense. People believed it was a punishment from God, a divine judgment on a sinful world. There was no scientific understanding of the disease, and treatments were a mix of superstition and useless remedies. The sight of the afflicted, with their fever buboes and dark splotches on their skin, was a terrifying one. The social order, which had been so rigid and hierarchical, was thrown into chaos. The sheer number of deaths meant that the traditional ways of life were no longer possible. The Black Death had a profound and lasting impact on the English economy and society. With so many people dead, there was a severe labor shortage. This was a revolutionary change, a power shift that would forever alter the relationship between the lord and the peasant. For the first time, peasants had bargaining power. They could demand higher wages for their labor and better terms for their tenancy. Landowners, desperate for people to work their fields, were forced to compete for a dwindling supply of labor. This led to a significant increase in the wages and standard of living for the surviving common people. The government's reaction to this new economic reality was swift and, from the peasants' perspective, completely unfair. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, a law that attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It was a desperate attempt by the ruling class to maintain the old social order, a move that was deeply unpopular and almost impossible to enforce. It created a deep and simmering resentment among the working class, a feeling that the government was not on their side and was actively trying to keep them poor. The statute, a futile attempt to turn back the clock, only highlighted the fundamental shifts in the economic landscape. The plague, in its own terrible way, had given the working class a new voice and a new sense of their own value. This new economic reality led to a number of other changes. Many peasants were able to buy their freedom from serfdom, and a new class of free laborers began to emerge. The old feudal system, which had been the backbone of Norman England, was slowly beginning to crumble. This wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual process of change, a slow erosion of the power of the landed aristocracy. The plague, for all its horror, was a catalyst for a new kind of society, one where the old rules no longer applied. This was a long-term consequence that nobody saw coming. The short-term consequence was a wave of popular anger and discontent that would eventually boil over into open rebellion. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, not between kings and barons, but between the rulers and the ruled. The memory of the plague and the government's perceived callousness was a powerful motivator for a people who felt they had nothing left to lose. The social and economic upheaval caused by the Black Death and the government's callous response to the labor shortage created a deep and lasting wellspring of discontent. For decades, the simmering resentment grew, fueled by new, radical ideas about social justice and equality. The official church, with its immense wealth and its close ties to the ruling class, was seen by many as part of the problem. A group of wandering preachers, known as Lollards, began to spread a new message, arguing that the Bible, not the Pope or the church hierarchy, was the ultimate source of religious authority, and that all men were equal in the eyes of God. These ideas, while not directly responsible for the rebellion, provided a philosophical framework for the anger that was boiling beneath the surface. The final struggle came in 1381 with the imposition of the poll tax. This was a new tax, levied on every person over the age of 15, regardless of their wealth or status. It was a deeply unfair and regressive tax, and it was the catalyst for a massive popular uprising. The rebellion began in the villages of Essex and Kent, where royal tax collectors were met with open defiance and violence. The rebels, a huge, undisciplined army of peasants, farmers, and artisans, began to march on London with a surprising amount of coordination and speed. They were led by a charismatic farmer from Kent named Wat Tyler, a man who would become the face of the revolt, and a radical preacher named John Ball, who famously preached that when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, a simple, powerful message of social equality. The rebels, having defeated a small royal force, marched into London in June of 1381. The city, which was supposed to be a bastion of royal power, was thrown into chaos. The gates were opened for them by sympathetic Londoners, and the rebels were able to seize control of much of the city. They targeted the symbols of their oppression, the lawyers, the tax collectors, and the wealthy merchants. They burned John of Gaunt's magnificent palace, the Savoy, and they executed the unpopular Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also the Lord Chancellor, and as such was responsible for the hated poll tax. The young king, Richard II, a boy of just 14, was trapped in the Tower of London, a terrifying position for a teenage monarch. In a moment of incredible courage, Richard II rode out to meet the rebels. He met with them at Mile End, and in a display of remarkable political savvy, agreed to their demands. He promised to abolish serfdom, pardon the rebels, and repeal the poll tax. The rebels, believing they had won, began to disperse. But Wat Tyler, the rebel leader, was not content. He demanded even more reforms, and he met with the king again at Smithfield. The meeting quickly went wrong. Tyler was killed by the mayor of London, possibly in a pre-arranged plot. The peasant army, leaderless and shocked, was now at a loss. Richard, showing a sudden flash of his Plantagenet steel, rode out to them and famously declared, "I am your captain, follow me." The rebels, having just lost their leader, were disarmed by this bold display of authority. The revolt was over. The king and the government, having regained control, immediately went back on all of their promises. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, with hundreds of peasants executed. The government was not going to give up its power and wealth without a fight. The peasants' revolt was ultimately a failure. It did not end serfdom or fundamentally change the social structure of England, but it was a powerful statement from the common people, a reminder to the ruling class that there was a limit to how much they could be pushed. It showed that the power of the king was not absolute, and that the common people, with a shared grievance, could rise up and challenge the established order. The long-term effects of the revolt were more subtle but no less significant. The ruling class, terrified by what had happened, became more cautious, and serfdom, which was already in decline, slowly began to fade away over the next century. The peasants' revolt was a fiery, brutal end to a century of deep social change, a harbinger of a new kind of social consciousness. The tumultuous reign of Richard II, punctuated by the peasants' revolt, was a complex and tragic one. He was a young king who showed flashes of great courage and intelligence, but he was also prone to acts of tyranny and paranoia. After the revolt, he gradually reasserted his authority, but he ruled with an iron fist, punishing those who had opposed him with a viciousness that alienated the powerful English nobles. He had his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, murdered and seized the lands of another powerful nobleman, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. This act, the illegal seizure of an inheritance, was a step too far. It was a direct violation of the feudal principles that were the bedrock of medieval society. It was a move that no nobleman, no matter how loyal, could ignore. Richard had, in effect, declared that no one's property was safe. Henry Bolingbroke, exiled in France, saw his opportunity. In 1389, with Richard away on a military campaign in Ireland, Henry returned to England with a small force. The country, tired of Richard's tyranny and his unpredictable behavior, flocked to his banner. The rebellion was a stunning success. Richard, upon his return, found himself without an army and without a single loyal subject. He was forced to surrender and was imprisoned in the Tower of London. In a rare and dramatic move, a new parliament was called, and it officially deposed Richard II, an act that had only happened once before, with the deposition of the unpopular Edward II. Henry Bolingbroke, with a rather flimsy claim to the throne, was crowned King Henry IV. This was not a simple change of succession. It was a revolution. Henry had not inherited the throne. He had seized it by force. This act set a dangerous precedent. The crown could now be taken, not just inherited. Henry IV's reign from 1389 to 1413 was dominated by his attempts to legitimize his rule and to put down a series of rebellions. The most famous of these was the rebellion of Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh nobleman who declared himself Prince of Wales and led a long, bitter war for Welsh independence. It was a costly and brutal conflict, and it showed that the wounds of Edward the Third's conquest had never truly healed. The rebellion was eventually put down, but it was a constant drain on the kingdom's resources and a source of ongoing instability. Henry IV also faced a number of other rebellions from powerful English nobles who believed his claim to the throne was illegitimate. The most famous of these was the Percy family of Northumberland, who had originally supported him but then turned against him. They were defeated at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, but the constant threat of rebellion and the immense stress of a shaky claim to the throne wore Henry down. When Henry IV died, his son Henry V inherited a kingdom that was far from stable. But Henry V was a different kind of king. He was a great warrior, a brilliant military strategist, and a man who understood the power of propaganda. He was determined to restore the prestige of the English crown and to settle the legitimacy of his dynasty once and for all. He did this in the most dramatic way possible by restarting the 100 Years' War with France. The war, which had been in a state of truce for many years, was a perfect distraction from the kingdom's internal problems. He could unite the English nobles and people against a common enemy and win a legitimacy that his father had never possessed. In 1415, Henry V launched his invasion. He was a charismatic and inspiring leader, and his army, though small, was fiercely loyal. He marched his army deep into French territory and met a much larger French force at the Battle of Agincourt. The French, with their heavy cavalry and their old-fashioned tactics, were completely unprepared for the English longbowmen and the discipline of the English infantry. The battle was a complete and utter rout, a stunning victory that cemented Henry VI's reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in English history. It was a victory that for a time brought immense national pride and seemed to legitimize the entire Lancastrian dynasty. He had not just defeated the French, he had proven that he was a true king, a legitimate heir to the glorious past of the Plantagenets. The spectacular victory at Agincourt in 1415 made Henry V a national hero and seemed to legitimize his Lancastrian dynasty. He was now a king not just by force, but by glorious conquest, a figure of immense national pride. He used his victory to press his claim to the French throne with renewed vigor. The French kingdom, meanwhile, was in the midst of its own civil war between two powerful factions of the royal family, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This internal conflict left them weak and unable to mount a coordinated defense against the English. Henry V, a shrewd and pragmatic leader, was able to take full advantage of this chaos. He forged a powerful alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, and together they were a force that the French could not stop. The high water mark of Henry's ambition came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. This was a stunning diplomatic victory that seemed to make his dreams of a dual monarchy a reality. The treaty stipulated that Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French King Charles VI, and that their future son would inherit both the English and the French crowns. It also disinherited the French Dauphin, the true heir, and recognized Henry as the regent of France. To the English, it seemed as if they had won the 100 Years' War. The English king was now the undisputed ruler of both England, France, and France, and a new, even more powerful Anglo-French kingdom was about to be born. But destiny as it often does, as it had other plans. Henry V, the greatest warrior king of his age, died suddenly in 1422 at the age of just 35, likely from dysentery he contracted during a campaign. A few months later, the French King Charles VI also died. The heir to both crowns was now Henry VIII's son, a baby of just 9 months old, who was now proclaimed King Henry VI of both England and France. This was a recipe for disaster. A child king was a weak king, and England was now ruled by a council of nobles who had to govern 2 kingdoms from a distance. The English position in France, which had been so strong under Henry V, began to unravel. The revival of French fortunes was spurred by one of the most unlikely figures in history, a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc. Claiming to have received divine messages from saints, she inspired the French Dauphin and his armies with a new sense of purpose and national pride. She was a living symbol of French resistance, and her presence on the battlefield, with her white banner and her unshakable faith, was a powerful psychological weapon. The French, who had been on the verge of total collapse, were now fighting with a new sense of religious fervor. Under her leadership, they were able to relieve the siege of Orleans, a crucial turning point in the war, and they went on to defeat the English in a number of key battles. Joan of Arc was eventually captured by the Burgundians, who sold her to the English. In a deeply cynical move, the English put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft. She was convicted and burned at the stake in 1431, a brutal end for a young woman who had changed the course of the war. Her death, however, did not stop the French momentum. In fact, it only made her a martyr, a national hero who inspired the French to fight on with even greater ferocity. The English, in their arrogance, had thought they could defeat her by killing her, but they had only created a legend. The war began to turn decisively against England. The Duke of Burgundy, seeing that the tide had turned, switched his allegiance and made a separate peace with the French Dauphin. The English were now isolated and on the defensive. They began to lose territory after territory in France, until all that was left was the port city of Calais. The 100 Years' War, which had begun with a stunning display of English military prowess, ended in a slow, humiliating defeat. The English crown, which had briefly held a glorious dual monarchy, was now left with only its island kingdom. The failure of the war and the weakness of the child king Henry VI would create a power vacuum that would eventually plunge the kingdom into a long and bloody civil war of its own. The humiliation of losing the 100 Years' War and the perceived weakness of King Henry VI created a power vacuum at the heart of the English government. Henry VII, the son of the great warrior king, was a gentle and pious man, but he was also a fragile ruler, prone to periods of mental instability. He was, in a word, not a king for a time of crisis. The English nobles, accustomed to the strong-handed rule of a warrior king, grew increasingly frustrated with Henry's weakness and the incompetence of his government. This frustration, combined with the personal ambitions and rivalries of the great noble families, created a perfect storm for a long and bloody civil war. The conflict, which would last for 3 decades, is known as the Wars of the Roses. The name, a romantic invention from a much later period, refers to the heraldic badges of the 2 main rival families, the red rose of the House of Lancaster and the white rose of the House of York. The roots of the conflict were both political and personal. The Lancastrian dynasty had been founded on the usurpation of the throne by Henry IV, a fact that was never forgotten by his opponents. The Yorkist claim to the throne was, in many ways, stronger from a purely hereditary standpoint. Richard, Duke of York, was a descendant of both Edward III's second and fourth sons, giving him a powerful claim that was, in the eyes of many, more legitimate than the Lancastrian line, which came from the third son. The war began in 1455 with the First Battle of St. Albans. It wasn't a huge battle, but it was a crucial turning point, a moment that showed the political divisions were now too deep to be solved by anything other than warfare. For the next 2 decades, the kingdom was plunged into a brutal cycle of battles, political intrigue, and assassination. The war was fought mostly by the nobility and their retainers. It wasn't a total war that destroyed the entire country, but it was a devastating and personal conflict for the noble families involved. There was no mercy. When a nobleman was captured, he was often executed on the spot. It was a war of revenge and personal vendettas, a family feud on a national scale. The conflict saw the crown change hands a number of times. The Lancastrian cause was led by the formidable Queen Margaret of Anjou, a fierce and determined woman who was a far more effective leader than her husband. The Yorkist cause was led by Richard, Duke of York, and later by his son, the charismatic and brilliant warrior, Edward IV. Edward IV was a towering figure, a master of military tactics, and a decisive leader who was able to seize the throne in 1461. He was the first of the Yorkist kings, and his reign brought a period of relative peace and stability. He was an effective and popular ruler, and it seemed as though the Yorkist dynasty was now firmly established. But the war was never truly over. The Lancastrians, with their supporters in exile, were always a threat. The return of the king's brother, Richard of Gloucester, from exile and his seizure of power would plunge the kingdom back into a final, bloody chapter of the Civil War. The Wars of the Roses, for all their brutality, were also a period of social change. The nobility, who had been the main fighting force, were decimated. Many of the old families were wiped out, and their vast estates were confiscated by the crown. This had the effect of strengthening the power of the monarchy and weakening the power of the great landholding families. When the war finally ended, the monarchy would be more powerful than it had been in centuries. The old feudal order, with its powerful barons and their private armies, was on its way out. The wars, while a product of the old medieval system, would also be a major catalyst for its end. The stage was now set for the final act of this long, bloody saga, a final battle that would bring a new dynasty to the throne and usher in a new era. The brief unstable peace of the Wars of the Roses was shattered by the death of the Yorkist king Edward IV in 1483. His son and heir, another Edward, was a boy of just 12 years old. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector, the temporary ruler of the kingdom, until the young king came of age. But Richard had his own ambitions. He quickly moved to isolate his young nephew, claiming that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid and that his children were therefore illegitimate. This was a stunning and completely unsubstantiated claim, but it was a politically powerful one. With the young princes declared illegitimate, Richard was now the next in line to the throne. He seized the crown for himself, becoming King Richard III. The two young princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were placed in the Tower of London for their protection. They were never seen again. Their disappearance and the strong suspicion that Richard III had them murdered is one of the most famous and enduring mysteries of English history. Historians still argue whether he was a ruthless usurper or a victim of Tudor propaganda, but the popular image of him is that of a monstrous villain, a man who would stop at nothing to get the crown. Richard III's reign was short, lasting just over 2 years, and was marked by political instability and a constant fear of rebellion. His usurpation of the throne and the disappearance of his nephews had alienated many of the old Yorkist supporters. A new challenger, a man who had been living in exile in Brittany, was now waiting in the wings. His name was Henry Tudor. Henry's claim to the throne was, to be charitable, tenuous. It came through his mother's side, and it was based on an illegitimate line of the House of Lancaster. But he was a man who understood how to play the game of political alliances. He was able to gain the support of many of the powerful Lancastrian exiles, and he also made a clever marriage proposal to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This promised to unite the two warring houses, and with it to end the bloody conflict once and for all. In 1485, Henry Tudor, with a small force of loyal exiles and mercenaries, landed in Wales. He was a master of propaganda, and he was able to frame his invasion not as a personal power grab, but as a crusade to save England from a tyrannical usurper. As he marched through the country, he was able to gather more and more support. The final showdown between the two men came on a field near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22, 1485, was the last major battle of the Wars of the Roses and one of the most consequential battles in English history. Richard III, a brave and experienced warrior, rode into battle with his crown on his head, a symbol of his kingly authority. He fought with a desperate ferocity, but his forces were betrayed by key noblemen, most notably the Stanley family, who had feigned loyalty to Richard, but who waited for the opportune moment to switch sides. Richard, seeing his forces crumble, launched a desperate last-ditch charge directly at Henry Tudor. It was a bold move, a final, reckless attempt to win the battle in a single stroke, but he was cut down by Henry's men. His death on the battlefield was a decisive victory for Henry Tudor. Legend has it that Richard's crown, found in a hawthorn bush after the battle, was placed on Henry's head, and he was proclaimed king. The Battle of Bosworth Field was over, and with it, the Plantagenet dynasty came to an end. The Wars of the Roses were finally over. A new era, a new dynasty, and a new kind of England was about to begin. The final chapter of the Middle Ages in England was drawing to a close. Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, had won the crown on the battlefield, but the real work of his reign was just beginning. His victory at Bosworth had ended the Plantagenet dynasty and the Wars of the Roses, but it hadn't automatically brought peace and stability. The kingdom was exhausted by decades of civil war. The treasury was nearly empty, and there were still many powerful noblemen who were more than willing to challenge the authority of a new king, especially one with such a weak claim to the throne. Henry VI was not a warrior king like Richard III or Henry V. He was a meticulous, cautious, and brilliant administrator, a man who understood that his survival depended on his ability to rebuild a strong and stable government. He was, in many ways, the first modern monarch of England. His first priority was to legitimize his rule and to remove any potential rivals. The marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, was a brilliant political move. It united the two warring houses and ended the dynastic feud once and for all. Their son, Arthur, was a child of both Lancaster and York, a symbol of a new era of unity. Henry also took a very pragmatic approach to his enemies. He didn't want to engage in a long and bloody campaign of revenge. Instead, he used a combination of intimidation and reconciliation to bring the old nobility to heel. He created a new and powerful body known as the Court of Star Chamber, which was designed to deal with the most powerful nobles who were too influential to be dealt with in the traditional courts. It was a court without a jury, a powerful tool that allowed him to punish those who threatened his rule without fear of an uncooperative verdict. Henry's reign was a period of financial reconstruction. He was obsessed with money and with rebuilding the royal treasury, which had been bled dry by the wars. He was a master of fiscal policy, and he used a number of creative and often unpopular methods to raise money. He was known for his acts of attainder, where he would declare a nobleman a traitor and confiscate all of his land and wealth. He also used a system of bonds and recognizances, essentially forcing nobles to pay large sums of money as a guarantee of their good behavior. This was an ingenious way to keep the powerful nobility in check while also filling the royal coffers. While he was not a popular king, he was a highly effective one, and by the end of his reign, the English crown was financially secure for the first time in a century. Henry VII also had to deal with a number of pretenders to the throne, men who claimed to be the princes who had disappeared in the Tower. The two most famous were Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. Simnel, a young boy who claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, the last male heir of the House of York, was easily defeated and was given a job in the royal kitchens as a bizarre display of royal clemency. Warbeck, who claimed to be the younger of the two princes, was a more serious threat and was supported by the King of France and the Duke of Burgundy. He was eventually captured and, after a series of failed escape attempts, was executed. The defeat of these pretenders showed that the Tudor dynasty was here to stay. Henry VII's reign was a quiet, steady hand that brought an end to the chaotic violence of the medieval period. He wasn't a warrior, but he was a genius of political maneuvering and administration. He restored law and order, rebuilt the royal treasury, and established a new dynasty that would go on to be one of the most famous in all of history. The medieval period, with its powerful barons, its endless civil wars, and its chivalric ideals, was slowly fading into the past. A new era, a new century, and a new kind of monarchy was about to begin. The final chapter of this long story was drawing to a close, and a new book was about to be opened. The new Tudor dynasty, established by Henry VII, brought a quiet end to the tumultuous political landscape of medieval England. The age of great noble families wielding immense power and fighting private wars was over. Henry VII, through his ruthless efficiency and financial acumen, had created a new kind of monarchy, one that was financially solvent and politically secure. He was a king who understood that the foundation of his power was not in the glory of the battlefield, but in the meticulous details of administration and finance. He was a king who ruled from the counting house, not the war tent. His reign, from 1485 to 1509, was a period of consolidation, a time when the kingdom was able to heal from the wounds of the Civil War and prepare for a new kind of future. But the end of the medieval period was more than just a change in dynasty. It was a time of profound and lasting cultural and intellectual change. The old, chivalric world of knights and castles was slowly fading, replaced by a new era of gunpowder, cannons, and professional armies. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy and its ties of loyalty and land, was in a state of slow decline. The Black Death, as we remember, had already shaken the foundations of this system, and the Peasants' Revolt had shown that the old order was not as stable as it once seemed. The Wars of the Roses had finished the job, decimating the old nobility and creating a power vacuum that a strong, centralized monarchy was more than happy to fill. The intellectual world was also undergoing a revolution. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century meant that books, which had once been a rare and expensive luxury, were now being produced in a much greater volume. This had a profound effect on literacy and on the spread of new ideas. The Renaissance, which had begun in Italy, was slowly making its way across the Channel, bringing with it a new interest in classical learning, humanism, and art. The focus was shifting from the divine to the human, from the theological to the secular. This was not a sudden change, but a gradual process of intellectual and artistic awakening, a slow and steady blossoming of new ideas. The geographical world was also expanding in a way that would have been unimaginable to a medieval peasant. The voyages of discovery by explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama were opening up new trade routes and new continents. England, which had for centuries been a small island kingdom on the periphery of Europe, was now in a position to become a major player on the world stage. The riches of the New World were on their way, and a new age of global trade and empire was about to begin. The old, so inward-looking world of the Middle Ages was being replaced by a new, globalized one. One of the key things historians still argue about is the exact moment when the medieval period truly ended and the early modern period began. Was it with the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, which ended the Plantagenet dynasty? Was it with the beginning of the Reformation in the early 16th century, which shattered the religious unity of Europe? Or was it with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, an event that sent a shockwave of intellectual change across the continent? The truth, of course, is that there is no single moment. History doesn't work that way. It's a continuous, flowing river, and the end of one era is always a gradual, complex transition to the next. The late 15th century was a time of profound change, a slow but steady shift from the old to the new. The long story of medieval England, with its triumphs and its tragedies, was drawing to a quiet, steady close. The stage was set, the characters were waiting, and the next great chapter of English history was about to begin. The close of the 15th century and the reign of Henry VII represents a transition from the medieval to the early modern period, but this transition was not a sudden one. Medieval habits of thought and social structures lingered, even as new ideas began to take root. The Tudor dynasty, while representing a clean break from the Plantagenets, was still a product of the medieval world, and Henry VII, for all his modern methods, was still a medieval king. He was the last English king to have won his crown on the battlefield, and he spent his entire reign solidifying his power and ensuring that no one else could do the same. His paranoia, his meticulous record-keeping, and his obsession with money were all products of the chaotic world from which he had emerged. He understood that in a world where a powerful nobleman could raise an army and challenge the crown, financial and political stability were not luxuries, but necessities for survival. This period also saw the final echoes of the old noble power struggles. The last years of the 15th century were a time of peace, but it was a fragile peace, one that was always at risk of being shattered by a new pretender or a disgruntled nobleman. The defeat of Perkin Warbeck, the final and most dangerous of the pretenders, in 1497, was a moment that showed the new dynasty was secure, but it was also a reminder of how close it had come to being overthrown. The old medieval world, with its chivalric codes and its personal loyalties, was still a powerful force, and it was a force that Henry VII had to constantly work to control. He was a master of political theater, and he used his ceremonies and his court to project an image of power and stability that his father-in-law, Edward IV, had perfected. The end of the medieval period also saw the rise of a new kind of social class, the gentry. These were men who were not of the old nobility, but who had gained their wealth and their power through land ownership and through service to the king. They were a new, upwardly mobile class, and they were more than happy to support a king who was willing to curb the power of the old, arrogant nobility. This new class of gentries and merchants would become the backbone of Tudor England, a powerful and loyal base of support for a new kind of government. The old feudal world, where a man's worth was based on his noble birth and his personal loyalty to a powerful lord, was slowly being replaced by a new world, where a man's worth was based on his wealth, his education, and his service to the king. The late 15th century also saw the final chapter in the long and bitter wars with Scotland. The two kingdoms had been fighting for centuries, and while there would be more conflicts in the future, the intensity of the old border wars was beginning to fade. Henry VII's daughter, Margaret, was married to the Scottish King James IV, a political marriage that was designed to bring a new era of peace and cooperation between the two kingdoms. It was a far-sighted and diplomatic move, a stark contrast to the brutal and often pointless wars of the past. It was an acknowledgement that a new kind of relationship, one based on diplomacy and dynastic ties rather than on constant warfare, was necessary for the long-term stability of the island. And so, we arrive at the cusp of the 16th century. The long, winding road of medieval England, a story of Saxons and Vikings, of Normans and Plantagenets, of civil wars and grand military campaigns was drawing to a close. The new Tudor dynasty was in place, the old nobility was tamed, and a new kind of society was beginning to emerge. The old certainties were gone, and the new ones had not yet been fully formed. It was a time of transition, a moment of profound change, and a quiet end to a long and fascinating story. The final chapter, a brief look at the state of England at the close of the 15th century, will bring us to a soft and peaceful landing. The stories are coming to an end, the memories are beginning to fade, and a new day is dawning. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, at a moment of transition where the stories of the past are beginning to give way to the narratives of a new age. The medieval period in England, a long and often brutal epic of conquest, civil war, and profound change, was drawing to its quiet conclusion under the cautious hand of Henry VII. The kingdom he ruled was, in many ways, very different from the one that had existed just a century before. The great families who had once held so much power were now largely tamed, their private armies gone, and their loyalty to the crown a matter of necessity rather than choice. The old feudal order, with its powerful barons and its serfdom, was in a state of terminal decline, a victim of plague, social change, and the king's own ruthless ambition. The country was, for the first time in a very long time, at peace. This peace, however, was not the end of change. It was simply a pause, a moment of reflection before the next great chapter of history began. The forces that would define the next century, the Reformation, the rise of a global empire, the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance, were already stirring. But for now, in the quiet, steady years of the late 15th century, England was content to simply be. The old certainties, which had been so brutally challenged, were gone, and the new ones had not yet fully arrived. It was a time of transition, a moment when the long, winding road of the past finally came to a gentle, steady halt. The stories we have told of Alfred the Great and his struggle against the Vikings, of William the Conqueror and his brutal new order, of King John and the Magna Carta, of the long, bloody civil wars and the rise of the Tudors, are now just that, stories. They are the echoes of a world that is no longer with us, a world of knights and castles, of kings and peasants, and of a sense of order that was both magnificent and brutal. The kingdom, after a long and turbulent night, was now beginning to wake to a new dawn. The long, winding journey through the forests of the past has come to its gentle, quiet end. The sounds of battle have faded into the whispers of the wind, and the stories of the men and women who lived and died in this ancient land are now just a part of the quiet earth. The castles, once so full of life and noise, are now silent sentinels, standing watch over a land that has long since forgotten their purpose. And the sun, as it sets on this long and winding story, casts its final golden light on a quiet, peaceful landscape. The story is over now, and it's time to rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.